Hello, my name is Jenna Venuto. I'm in the Applied Behavior Analysis program at the University of Kentucky. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about my upcoming thesis titled A Single Session Interview-Informed Synthesized Contingency Analysis to Inform Parent-Implemented Treatment for Challenging Behavior in Adolescents. During this presentation, I'll talk about the supporting literature, my research questions, and my method. The study will have two parts, so I will explain both of those in more depth. Functional analyses, or FAs, are direct assessments that involve several options for determining the function of challenging behavior. The purpose of an FA is to determine possible environmental contingencies that may be reinforcing challenging behavior, which can then be used to determine a more appropriate replacement behavior. There are four possible functions of behavior or reasons a behavior is occurring. These are access to attention, access to preferred items and activities, escape from demands, and automatic or sensory stimulation. While FAs are often lengthy, the interview-informed synthesized contingency analysis, or the IISCA, was developed to increase the efficiency of FAs requiring only 25 minutes to complete. Recently, a variation of this assessment, termed the single-session IISCA, suggested that conducting only one session of the traditional IISCA could be effective in identifying the function of a child's behavior in only 5 minutes. Whereas I mentioned before, the traditional IISCA takes about 25 minutes, and other FAs can take hours or even multiple days to conduct. In a single session IISCA, the environment is set up in a way that is known to evoke challenging behavior. When the behavior occurs, it's immediately reinforced to terminate the behavior. This is repeated for 5 minutes in hopes of being able to systematically turn the behavior on and off. While it might seem counterintuitive to reinforce or give in to challenging behavior, being able to systematically turn the behavior on and off will tell us why the behavior is happening. Identifying the function of challenging behavior can help identify a functionally equivalent replacement behavior that the individual can learn to use rather than engage in the challenging behavior. This is called differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. While the single session IISCA is a very new variation of the traditional IISCA, it's still lacking research evidence of its effectiveness. There are also gaps in research of IISCAs being conducted with adolescents and in caregiver implementation of treatment following an IISCA. Based on the gaps in research that I just mentioned, the current study seeks to find the answers to the following questions. What is the differentiation in problem behavior per second when reinforcement is absent compared to when reinforcement is present in a single session IISCA conducted in a clinic setting? If data is differentiated, will the single session IISCA inform a function-based treatment that leads to therapeutic improvements for adolescents with a disability when implemented by parents or caregivers in a clinic setting? And finally, will therapeutic improvements generalize to the home setting during a generalization probe? Adolescents and their caregivers will be recruited for this study. Adolescents need to be between 12 and 17 years old, qualify for special education services or have a developmental disability, and engage in challenging behavior with reliable precursors. Caregivers need to be at least 18 years old, have access to Wi-Fi and video conferencing, and have the availability and the means to come to each session. To start, I'm going to be talking about Experiment 1, which is the evaluation of the single session IISCA. I'm going to start the evaluation with an open-ended interview with the caregiver. And the purpose of this interview is to find relevant background information such as child preferences and their language abilities. And then I'm going to also ask questions to inform the design of the IISCA. So I'm going to ask questions about what the behavior looks like, what typically happens before the behavior, what typically happens after the behavior, and any precursors. So is there anything that signals that this behavior is going to happen? And I'll go into what those might look like in a little bit. But then following that interview, I'm going to do an observation with the adolescent. There's going to be no data taken during this observation. It's really just an opportunity for me to interact with the adolescent and to refine my definitions of the challenging behavior. I'm going to probe some of the contingencies that were talked about in that interview, and it'll let me solidify the procedures of the IISCA conditions that I am creating. During the single session IISCA evaluation, I'll be looking at the rate per second of dangerous and non-dangerous behaviors during reinforcement present and reinforcement absent intervals. To break this down, dangerous behaviors are behaviors that put the participant or others at risk of harm or injury. So these might be aggression or property destruction. Non-dangerous precursor behaviors are behaviors that typically occur prior to the dangerous behavior that signals the possible occurrence of that dangerous behavior. So examples of this are crying, screaming, verbal threats, things like that. As mentioned previously, I will be trying to evoke the challenging behavior, but then give in to the behavior by reinforcing it as soon as the adolescent engages in it. If I know the precursor behaviors, I can reinforce or give in when I see that non-dangerous behavior so that the dangerous behavior never even has to occur. The reinforcement present intervals are exactly what they sound like. The adolescent will have access to reinforcement. So they'll have access to preferred items, access to my attention, no demands will be placed. I'll really just be following the child's lead during these intervals. The reinforcement absent intervals are where I will try and evoke the challenging behavior based on what the hypothesized function of behavior is. So if I hypothesize that behavior is reinforced by my attention, I will remove my attention. If I believe that challenging behavior is maintained by access to preferred items, then preferred items will be removed. And also, if I think challenging behavior is maintained by escape from demands, then I will be placing demands. So any combination of those functions of behavior can be included during these. During the reinforcement absent intervals, if challenging behavior occurs, the adolescent will immediately be given access to reinforcement, which is the reinforcement present intervals. That'll last for 30 seconds. So after 30 seconds, then the reinforcement absent intervals will be initiated again, and I'll try to evoke the behavior. So the reinforcement present and the reinforcement absent intervals will be rapidly alternated with the presentation and removal of reinforcers for each participant, and this will last 5 minutes. So it's predicted that the rate of challenging behaviors would be low during reinforcement present intervals and would be high during the reinforcement absent intervals. So if this is true, then a function can be determined. The experimental design that I'm using is called an alternating treatments design. This is a single case research design that will allow me to compare the rate of problem behavior per second during the reinforcement present intervals and reinforcement absent intervals. So as I mentioned previously, I will be rapidly alternating the reinforcement absent and reinforcement present intervals contingent on problem behavior. So here you can see examples. This is from an article by Jessel and colleagues, that you can see that the rate of problem behavior during the reinforcement absent intervals was higher than instances in the reinforcement present intervals, and that's what we would expect to see. If a function is determined based on the single session IISCA, to know if those assessment results are accurate, we'll develop a treatment based on those results that will teach the adolescent a new, more appropriate way to express their wants and needs in hopes of decreasing that challenging behavior. This is DRA, or differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior. The caregiver will be trained to implement the treatment with the child. The dependent variable for the treatment evaluation is the rate per minute of challenging behavior and rate per minute of an alternative behavior. The challenging behavior that will be recorded is the dangerous and non-dangerous behaviors identified in the interview and that were used during the single session IISCA. The alternative behavior will be an appropriate behavior that is functionally equivalent to the challenging behavior. These will be assessed during 5-minute sessions. As an example, if I were engaging in challenging behavior to escape task demands, an appropriate alternative behavior might be to teach me to ask for a break. This provides me the same reinforcement because I still get a break from work, but it's much more appropriate than engaging in challenging behavior. Once a DRA protocol is developed, before starting the treatment evaluation, caregivers will be trained to implement the DRA protocols using behavioral skills training, or BST. In BST, there's 6 steps to teaching the individual the skill. The first step is instruction. Here I'll explain the treatment protocols, I'll define target behaviors, and provide a rationale for why a DRA protocol should be successful. Next, I'll provide a written description. This will provide written details of the treatment and will include descriptions of how to respond to different situations that may come up during treatment, such as how to respond if the adolescent doesn't respond. Next, I will model the DRA protocol with the adolescent to show the caregiver what it's supposed to look like. Next is a rehearsal step, so the caregiver will practice implementing the DRA protocol with the adolescent. Next, they'll be given feedback on what they did well as areas of improvement. And then we repeat the model, rehearsal, and feedback steps. So models will continue to be given if needed, and the caregiver will continue to practice and receive feedback until they demonstrate the protocols correctly 2 times. Next, the adolescents would be taught to use the alternative behavior. If the alternative behavior is within the client's current repertoire, then we'd use BST. This would include the same 6 steps that I mentioned previously. So for the instruction, we'd explain what the alternative behavior is and why we need to use it. They'd be given a written description in the form of a visual that would show when you engage in the alternative behavior, you get reinforcement. And then I will model the alternative behavior. Then the adolescent will rehearse it and they'll be given feedback. And that will repeat until they correctly engage in the alternative behavior 2 times consecutively, and then they'll practice with the caregiver until they get it correct 2 times consecutively. If the alternative behavior is not within the adolescent's repertoire, then we'd use errorless teaching. For this, we'd set up an opportunity that typically would evoke some of that challenging behavior, but will immediately prompt them to use the alternative behavior. And then we'll respond based on if the adolescent responds correctly by using the alternative behavior, incorrectly by saying or doing something else other than the alternative behavior, or if they don't respond at all. We'd respond based on that. But when they respond correctly 2 times consecutively, then the caregiver will practice with them until they respond correctly 2 times. The idea of introducing treatment, and specifically introducing a differential reinforcement of alternative behavior protocol, is that the adolescent's use of alternative behavior increases and challenging behavior decreases. So to evaluate this, there's going to be 2 conditions that we randomly alternate, and that's going to be the treatment condition and a baseline condition. The treatment condition, which will be the differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, that will be caregiver implemented. Here, the use of the alternative behavior will be reinforced, while challenging behavior will no longer be reinforced. This will be compared to a baseline condition that will be implemented by the researcher. This will look the same as the assessment, so the reinforcement present intervals and reinforcement absent intervals will be the same. In this case, challenging behavior will be reinforced and the alternative behavior will not. While this does seem counterintuitive, it's important that we have a baseline to compare our results to so that we know for sure that the treatment is what is causing increases in that use of alternative behavior. Following this, a treatment generalization probe will be conducted in the adolescent's home via Zoom. Here, the caregiver will implement the treatment just as they did at the clinic, but in their home. And ideally, we would see that the adolescent is still using high rates of that alternative behavior in their home. Once again, an alternating treatments design would be used here, but the treatment condition would be compared to baseline conditions. These conditions would be randomly alternated with no more than 2 of the same conditions occurring back to back. Ideally, with this design, we would see that during treatment conditions, alternative behavior occurs more than in baseline conditions, and that can be seen in that top graph on the page. And we would predict that challenging behaviors occur less in treatment conditions than in baseline conditions, and that can be seen on that bottom graph. Finally, the social validity of the single session IISCA and the treatment that followed will be assessed. A semi-structured interview with caregivers and adolescents who are able and willing to answer the questions will be conducted. So I'll ask questions on the child's improvement in problem behavior, improvements in using the alternative behavior, the extent to which the single session IISCA was helpful, the practicality of treatment, and questions specific to the adolescents would be how the treatment and assessment made them feel, how the length of the assessment felt, and if treatment was helpful to them. This concludes my presentation. I want to thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.